Welcome to the Martinus Cosmology podcast. I am your host, Mary McGovern, and my guest today is Lasse Vogelsang. Welcome, Lasse.
Thank you.
Maybe you would like to present yourself and tell us something about your background?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Lasse, and you asked me before we started to talk a little bit about how I met Martinus, as we say in these circles. So I was in my teenage years, and I was just interested in what was life about. I couldn't understand why we had all these things going on, and not everything looked nice back then, to me at least. So I was really wondering what was the meaning of life, basically. So I was searching for that and came into some spiritual meditation kind of things, as people do, at least some people do. And at some point I found this white book by Martinus, and I started reading it, and then I left all the other stuff behind, and that was my introduction to that. And then I read the books for some years without really meeting other people who were interested in things, and then at some point I went to Clint, and you can say the rest is history. So,
yeah. And Clint is the Martinus Center, about 60 miles northwest of Copenhagen, where we run courses on Martinus' world picture in English, Danish, German, other languages.
Yeah.
But you came to the Martinus Center rather young, if I remember rightly.
Yeah, in the year 2000.
Yeah.
And I started reading it around 1992. So I was 17, something like that.
Just a teenager.
Yeah, exactly. And that was also my approach to it. I mean, I wasn't thinking about who has written these books, because I was so young that I wasn't thinking about that. But that came later.
Yeah.
So.
And what do you do in your daily life? What's your field? What's your work?
My field is IT, and right now I'm actually teaching young people.
Yeah.
To get ready for the real life out there in the IT business. So.
And real life, that's what we're going to talk about today.
It is.
Our theme for today is a question. Is there an absolute reality? Yeah, what do you say, Lasse? Is there an absolute reality?
Well, Martinus says there is an absolute reality. And this is based on a lecture I had some months ago, and I also have an academic background, maybe I should say that as well. And there's a lot of discussion within academia about, at least in some areas of academia, about what is reality. I mean, it's a philosophical question that has been there for thousands of years, right? And there's still a lot of debate going on. And one of them that came out, or was part of when I was studying at the university, was this: what is reality? What can we know about it? All these big philosophical questions. And I knew Martinus back then, or Martinus' work. So I always had this idea, maybe Martinus could actually give the answers to academia as well. So that is my motivation for being interested in these types of questions. That, I mean, I think he has nailed the answers to the questions, but understanding it is a bit of a challenge still. And this is part of that answer to what is reality in some ways. Is there an absolute reality? What can we know about it? All these kind of questions that for some people we don't care about them because we have our own opinion about it. But for some people it's not that simple. And this is part of that.
So this is why you got interested in this topic.
Yeah.
And of course some people find an answer in religion or in politics or in media, all sorts of, in science. People find their own versions of reality. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I guess part of it, right, is that we can see that we have so different understandings of what reality, or perceptions of what reality is. And right now it used to be religion that was sort of the big thing that provided us with the I used my title was real reality, but here's the absolute reality, or how we perceive reality. And I would say for many people, religion might not provide the same basis for life anymore. Especially the faith-based religions. I mean, they're fine, they're great for the people who can actually believe in them, but there are a lot of people today that has been so much schooled, and we are so used to that we need to reflect on everything. So just going into a church and say, this is how the world is without any explanation has become really hard. So science has also took over for a while, I would say, like 100 years ago. But even that, I mean, it has not really... It has provided a lot of great answers in the materialistic areas. That's why we can record this podcast today, right? Because we have all the technology and things. But there's this whole spiritual part of it, or the mental part of it, how we should think, how should our moral be, how should our ethics be. And right now it seems that, at least to some extent, that it's an anything goes kind of thing, right? There's no really... When we talk about materialistic science, there's a gravity and all these kind of things. We don't really question that much. But on this ethical or spiritual area, it's pretty much up to you, right? There's no science right now.
There's no science of morality
exactly
at the moment.
Well, some philosophers has tried, right? But there's no sort of common understanding.
And this lack of a common understanding has some consequences, doesn't it? If people see the world very differently, then it can lead to all sorts of unrest and intolerance and lack of understanding.
Yeah, I mean that's why we disagree to a large extent, right?
Yeah.
We know how to deal with a lot of the materialistic questions. There can be debates there as well, but on the moral issues, there are no right and wrong.
We can maybe agree about mathematics, like 2 + 2 is 4.
Exactly. Yeah.
But
and especially right now in the world, right, we see wars and all those kind of things coming up, right? And it's, of course, for some people, it's just, of course, we can go to war, right? That's not an issue, right? But that's an ethical question whether you can do that or not.
Yeah.
And right now, we don't have anything to really bring to the table and say, maybe that's not a great idea to start a war.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about how to help countries that are being attacked.
And to what extent and how, and should we bring them weapons, or do we become part of it? All those kind of things.
All of those ethical issues.
So in that area, that's I think Martinus provides some really strong arguments and perceptions of how reality is, or how the absolute reality is. However, I should say it in English.
So, what is absolute reality?
What is absolute reality? Yeah. Well, sometimes it's good to start what it's not. So Martinus is pretty clear on that. Sort of, we have two areas. We have what he calls relative truth and absolute truth. And relative truth is something timely. It's something that starts at a certain point and ends at another point.
So temporal.
Temporal.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that would actually be the materialistic view on the world. Something that comes and go. And the opposite to that, or the absolute truth, is something that has never started and will never end. So that's what Martinus goes into, and that's why he calls it the eternal world picture, because it's about eternal principles. So it's principles that has never started and will never end. And of course they also have another type of reality, you can say, in a way, because we cannot go out and point to them in the same way. I have a phone in my hand here, you cannot see it, but I can point to it and we can measure it and we can say a lot of temporary things about it. But these principles he has given is something we can not necessarily observe directly, but we can still see a lot of consequences, or what do you call it? Indications that they are there. So one example is the living being. He talks about that the living being has 3 principles. We have our eye, and it's not the eyes that we're looking with or seeing with, but the eyes in I do something.
Yeah.
So we have this director in us, and he says that's not a materialistic thing. That's an absolute or eternal principle. So it's just something there's no details to it. And then this I has a ability to create, and there's the creator. I don't want to go too much into that. That's a whole podcast, I think, to talk about that. Mm-hmm. But he has these eternal principles, and that's not something you work with within the science we have today. And there might be some aspects of it in religion, but it's not described in the way that Martinus is doing it. Mm. So he would say that all the temporary thing, all the relative things, they're definitely there, but it's not really this absolute truth. That's these principles, and it's not something he has obviously created in any way. It's something that has always been there. So he has just described them, He has described them, right?
Yeah.
And provided us a way to understand them as well.
So if you look at the living being, you can say, well, he weighs so and so many kilos, he's so many years old, he's got such and such an education, he's married or he's not married or whatever. You can measure all sorts of things about the person. But this core of being, this I, is not something you can see or measure.
Yeah.
But that's what's missing when someone dies. You can still see this organism, but the I and the ability to create through this organism has disappeared temporarily.
Yeah, he talks about this I as from a materialistic point of view, a timely point of view, that is sort of our blind spot. I mean, we have never seen our I, but it has always been there. Yeah. So it's not like it's not there, but it just has another status of reality, you can say.
Yeah. Yeah, so the I is an absolute reality.
Yeah, so that he would say that's an example of some eternal truth and then the living being also has this ability to create and be created. They are actually also eternal principles. Mm. But when we talk about sort of colors and size and all these kind of created things, that's just a part of it. So it's not the eternal view on them.
Yeah, they're like sort of temporal manifestations of an eternal principle.
Yeah, you can say that. Something like that.
Yeah. People can really doubt what reality is. I mean, they can feel that there's no meaning in life, that they lose some sort of anchor in life if they begin to, for example, if they begin to doubt religion or doubt marriage as a basis for happiness or money or whatever it is. I remember meeting someone who was very upset because he had earned over 1 million kroner, Danish kroner, in one morning, and he was very upset about it because, it was like, from a normal point of view, that was fantastic, but for him, it gave no meaning in life. He ended up giving up his job, becoming unemployed. So people can lose their sort of anchors, their materialistic anchors in life, when they begin to doubt that there is some sort of absolute reality behind their lives, as a basis for their lives. So what can we believe in? How can we know this absolute reality?
Well, as Martinus said, there's an analysis of the living being, but he also says that there's a plan for the whole thing, an eternal plan. And he describes that we have eternal life, and that goes in a circular fashion. And we can actually locate where we are in that plan right now. And he talks about that we are going from being like pure animals towards being real human beings. Martinus states that we are not real human beings yet. So we are partly our mentality, I should say, is partly animalistic and partly human. And the animal part of us is sort of where we get angry, and that's what makes us go to war and exploit other people and all these kind of things that we usually call, most of them we will call bad things. He actually talks about it being the evil part. And then we have the human part of us, and that's sort of basically neighborly love, where we have to treat each other well and basically serve each other. So Martinus can, based on these eternal principles, actually describe where we are right now and where we are coming from and where we are going towards, and what's the overall purpose of our life is right now. Why are we experiencing all the things we are experiencing right now? And that is essentially that we are developing from being animals to real human beings. That has a lot of aspects to it and a lot of things going on. Sexuality and all these kind of things are changing. Long story short, I'll just mention it. So that's sort of the overall plan with us right now. That doesn't mean that we cannot be interested in marriage or starting a new organization or what it's called, business. That was the word I was looking for. And we can have a lot of different interests that might not be directly pointed towards that development in sort of, from going from animal to human being, right? But he says understanding that that's actually what is going on can enable us to start working with ourselves and with that development. And that, he says, when we start doing that, that will actually make our life easier in some ways. It's not that it's always easy, I would say, but it's sort of give it a higher purpose in a way. If you buy into what Martinus is saying.
And it seems to be, according to Martinus, part of the plan that we lose this awareness of absolute reality. I just had the thought that there are many paintings with the same title, Time Unveiling the Truth. I've seen several with the same image, usually of a woman where angels are removing one veil after another. And I think that over time, through the animal kingdom, through all the painful experiences that we suffer, then we become wiser.
Yeah.
And we go from total lack of knowledge of absolute reality to complete knowledge of absolute reality. Or is that how you see it?
Yeah, and I'm thinking right now that Martinus can also explain why we are in the situation we are in right now.
Yeah.
He talks about this kredsløb, circular.
This principle of the cycle?
Principle of the cycle. So he essentially states that in order to perceive life or perceive anything, we need contrasts. So in the big picture, he says, sometimes we can be in a pleasureful or peaceful state for a long time, but we will actually get saturated by that at some point. And then we need the opposite experience in order to continue to renew our consciousness. And that might, for some people, be a little bit hard to grasp, that we need to get into these periods of time where we experience the opposite of a peaceful world, which is the suffering we are seeing in the world right now. But Martinus actually lays out a logical view on why that has to happen at a certain period of time in our life in order to actually have a life at all. That doesn't make the unpleasant pleasant or anything, but you can kind of have it in an arm length in some ways and say, okay, what is this that I'm experiencing right now? I need to learn something from it. What would that be? Come up with my own hypotheses on that. Sometimes you're right. Sometimes you have to be corrected a little bit. But he actually have this larger eternal plan for our life, where part of that is going through a period of time where we don't know, where we don't have this cosmic consciousness he's talking about, where you can actually see and understand, not with your physical eyes, but with intuition, understand the meaning of life, basically. But right now we don't have it. So we don't really understand what is going on, basically, in life, right? We don't know what life is. We don't know the solution to the mystery of life, basically. And that also means that we are, and this is Martinus' words, we make a lot of mistakes because we think the world is something which is basically isn't. And just that statement would be a little bit controversial in some contexts, right? Because then you're actually stating that there is this absolute truth. There's actually a higher meaning. There's a truth out there. There's things matters. That's the other part of it. If everything goes right, then who cares anyway, right? And that's part of what I think we're seeing right now, that your opinion is as good as mine, and it's not that you shouldn't be allowed to have your opinion, but if everything goes, what's left, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's quite important that just get to this idea that, well, there's probably a truth out there, right? Or at least if you say there isn't a truth, that's a truth as well. So you have a problem just by stating that. So to me, you have to work with the assumption that there's a truth out there, an absolute truth. There's actually a real world, and when we bring Martinus into that, it also have a meaning. So
yeah. And many people feel an enormous meaningless senselessness with life, and I very much like Martinus' term, the pleasant good and the unpleasant good, because I think those terms combine the temporal aspect with the eternal aspect. The Bible says everything is very good. It's a quote from the Bible at the end of the story of creation, where God looked at the world he had created and he said, "Behold, everything is very good." But then you just look at the news this morning and you think, well, what's good about that? It's certainly very painful, a lot of what's going on in the world at the moment. There are wars all over the place, revolution, and so on. So, from the temporal aspect, Martinus would agree that it's extremely unpleasant. But there is another view of it. You can have a higher view, where from an absolute point of view it is very good. But of course that shouldn't be used cynically, because it's painful. Just as something pleasant, it's also, to say it's pleasant is a temporal analysis, but it's also very good. But it's easier to accept that somehow.
We tend to blend the temporary eternal sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it can come across quite cynical, that saying, hey, it's very good that you've experienced these unpleasant things. But anyway, but the point is, he can actually explain to us that there's a meaning with the unpleasant. Yeah,
maybe it was one of his main roles was to explain the darkness, explain the meaning of all our dark experiences. And we experience darkness in all sorts of areas, financial, relationships, war, politics, health, you name it.
Why isn't it all just pleasant? If we have this almighty, powerful God somewhere, why do we need this?
Yeah.
And Martinus actually comes up with an explanation for why that has to be like that.
So what can we believe in? What can we know? How can we arrive at this experience of the absolute reality behind this temporal experience of life?
If we take Martinus' words, he tells us he had this cosmic consciousness and intuition. So that's one way and intuition works in a way where it's a way of getting the facts just automatically. So he could actually perceive in some ways all these principles. But that's not what the rest of us has, at least for now. Martinus tells us that we will get it, and we will get it fairly soon, within the next 3,000 years, and in eternity, that's pretty soon. For some of us, it might be, okay, can we get a little bit earlier? But anyway, but for us who doesn't have this intuition, at least to the same extent, as part of our daily consciousness, so what can we do, actually? And Martinus points quite a lot to nature. How does nature work? So if we're talking about this circular principle, he says, okay, what
principle of cycles?
Principle of cycles, thank you. What do we actually see in nature? And he talks about, we have the year, right, with spring, summer, fall, and winter. We have our whole life where we are born and we grow up, and there's the same principles in all of the things that we can actually go out and perceive. And then he states, why should the whole life be any different in what you see everywhere in nature? Of course, we take the departure in ourselves. I mean, we don't always go in these circular principles. We are breaking them all the time, and that's what causes some of our pain, I would say. But anyway, he says, go to nature, take a look at what nature is, and you can actually, if you really want to, see the principles there. He points quite a lot to what nature is in his writings, and he states directly that, hey, you can actually see the principles he explains as facts in nature. I'm still struggling a little bit with that, but it's a project to firstly understand what he's saying in the first place, and then see, okay, how can we actually, in science we talk about something being plausible. You can say it doesn't make sense. Does it provides me meaning? The best explanation. So you can say, okay, does what Martinus says, does it make sense? Does it actually align with what I'm experiencing in my own life, what I see in nature, what I see in general? So he says we should read his books, we should understand his work, his theory, you can say in a way, and then relate it to our own daily experiences, because that's all we got anyway. And he says that he even states that we don't have to be that intelligent in order to understand it. It's quite simple in a way what he's writing, but it's not that easy to understand.
No, and I think included in this principle of the cycles, like you talked about this, the 4 stages of being a person. You're a child, you're a youth, you're an adult, you're an old person. But there's a new cycle that you reincarnate. So this is not the only life we have. And of course, that's one of the dominant beliefs in the world at the moment, that we only have one life. And if that's your starting point, then nothing makes any sense. Then everything is unfair and there's no justice. But we know that we have winter, spring, summer, autumn, and we'll get a new winter and so on. So he uses this principle of the cycles to argue for the principle of reincarnation, which I think is terribly important if we're going to talk about an absolute reality.
Yeah, I mean, if one of the principles is the eternal life, and you have the perception that your life starts when you're born and it ends when you die, obviously that won't make any sense. That's not plausible. No. Something is not right. One of them.
No, and some of the religions have the idea that eternal life starts when you die, and then you have an eternal life. But for me, that's logical, because then eternity can't start anywhere.
Yeah, and Martinus will say the same.
It can't start at any point. So So for me, that was a very unsatisfactory answer in the religion I was brought up in.
So let's talk about why it's important.
So why is it important? Why is it important to know the truth, the absolute truth, or absolute reality?
My answer would be that one of the truths in Martinus' work is that we are undergoing this development. We are all different. We are at different stages. We look quite the same physically. And that's also why we have expectations that if I can do something, I expect you to do kind of the same. And if you don't, then if I'm intolerant, I would say, why didn't you do what I expected you to do, kind of things. So my point here is that acknowledging that we are on this path that I talked about, from animals to real human beings, and we are all under some kind of development. Like if you go to school, when you're in first grade, you can do something, and if you're in 10th grade, you can do something else. And you don't expect these, one in first grade and one in 10th grade, to be able to do the same. But our problem right now is that we cannot see that we are different. And it might be a little bit even politically incorrect to say that we are different. And one of the main points in Martinus' work is that it's not a problem. It's not even that you are, because you are more developed than someone else, that you are more valuable. You're just in a different place in life. I mean, we wouldn't say in some ways a 10th grader would be more valuable in some situation than a first grader, but we would not say that the 10th grader is better. Well, it's better, but you know what I mean, right? It's not like we will value both of them. Yeah. And we will know that the first grader would be 10th grader at some point, and in that way they have the same value in some ways. But when we look at people around the world, we don't see that, right? That we all under development, and Martinus also states that we cannot do any better than we are doing right now.
Tomorrow's another matter.
What?
Tomorrow is another matter.
Yeah, what we can do in the future, you mean? Yeah. So that's this whole question about being tolerant towards each other and understanding, again, back to what is life, right? If you have this one life view on the world and you're quite materialistic and interested in money, it's just about getting as much as you can, or if you want to be famous, you don't care about the rest, right? So it gives you another perspective on what life is and why you should actually be good to a neighbor, or at least try your best.
And Martinus talks about being good to your neighbor is what can open you up for a direct experience of absolute reality. For me, that gave me a sense of moral direction. Like the different gurus and different teachings talk about different paths to initiation. But I think in Martinus it's very clear that it's a moral path. It's a matter of what you have the heart to do to others. That was very, very important and very impressive for me. I thought, this is very clear. It's not about a particular mantra or a practice. It's about loving your neighbor as yourself. It's about what you have the heart to do to others.
Yeah, and that's I agree. That's what matters here. Yeah,
that's what really matters. Yeah. But then there's a big question. If I'm going to love my neighbor, I need to know who my neighbor is. Who is my neighbor? Is it just my friends, my family, other people, or is it more than that?
Well, they are definitely included. But Martinus also goes into animals, that we should treat them well. They are also living beings. They're just younger brothers, so to speak, in the eternal life. So we should treat them as well. So he states that we should at least consider being vegetarians. But he also talks about what he calls microcosmos, that our body, consists of organs and cells and so forth. And he says that's also living beings. So we also have to treat our body as well. We have this whole universe that is our body that we have to take care of, and that's also our responsibility. But firstly, if we can start to treat just the people closest to us as good as we can, I think that would be a pretty big step for us, and then the rest should at some point also be fixed. But he says that the people who annoys us or we get angry at, if we go that far, that's what we should work on. Try to understand why did that happen, why did I get irritated, annoyed, or whatever. What is it in me that triggers something, and try to work with that. And of course we can think about it. He also suggests that we can pray, basically ask for help. And sometimes we get it mentally, sometimes someone comes and tells you what's up and down in your problem at some point when you're ready for it. So it's pretty broad. It's every living being that we should treat well, you can say.
So it's an enormous project.
It is, and he also talks about that it has taken very long already, and it sounds like we are pretty close to the end of it, so to speak, that we are soonish, whatever that is, a couple of thousand years or whatever. So right now we're in a state where we can actually get work like the work Martinus has done, and we can actually start theoretically to understand what is going on, and at some point when that has happened, we can also have it practically and actually live this being good to your neighborly love kind of thing. So
we can understand that people have different points of view. If you're 2 years old, you have a different point of view than you have if you're 10 years old. It's the same with other kinds of differences. We have our particular standpoint in life, and we view life differently. You view it differently from the top of the mountain than you do from the bottom. So, without there being any value attached to that, but
yeah, and it's not that we should still consider what is going on. So that's not really the point, that we should just be fools running around accepting everything, in the sense that his point is that we should understand where people are, so we don't get irritated, we don't get angry.
Don't get irritated.
Yeah. We don't go to war with them to extreme, right? We understand where they are, and obviously, so he talks about this, that when you have this neighborly love, you can actually, when you have differences, you can actually find a way through your issues, you can say. So if we have a war going on, instead of getting the war started or an argument or whatever, right, you can actually find a way through it and get a peaceful result in the end. Of course, the wars will stop at some point, but the point here is that you are so developed that they don't occur, basically. They don't start in the first place. But we are not there yet, obviously.
We're not there yet, no.
But that's the project.
That's the project, and the more loving we become, the more we gain direct access to this experience of absolute reality.
Yeah, and you can also say that the idea that you can that this could actually be a reality. This could actually be the absolute truth, that we are within this, we are undergoing this development. If you don't even consider or will accept that there is any kind of truth out there, everything goes right. You have your opinion, I have mine. Nothing is better than the other one. I don't think we'll arrive at it, that there could be some common understanding. And without this common understanding, I think it's going to be quite difficult to agree on things and live basically peacefully with each other, right? It doesn't mean that we need the exact same view on things, but it's just can't remember if you said 2 plus 2 here or
Yeah, I did. Yes.
right. If we don't really discuss what 2 plus 2 is, but Martinus has this example that you can have different views on reality, and if we're looking at what 2 plus 2 is right now, because we know things about math, it's 4, right? But he used this as a symbol that some people think is 5, some other think is 7 or 3 or 2 or whatever. And obviously, the way we live our life, if the view on the world is adding 2 plus 2, and something is 2 and some other things is 5 or 6 or 7 or whatever, and no one really gets it's 4, obviously it will give some issues. I mean, we will not agree on things, right?
No, it was some...
And also the point here is that even when we agree that 2 plus 2 is 4, it doesn't mean that we have to be the same, basically. We can think in very different ways. And we also see that with materialistic science. Just getting all this knowledge about how the materialistic world is working has actually opened up for a lot of things we can do today that there was no way we could do 100 or 200 years ago. And maybe the same will happen with the spiritual science, that when we start to actually understand how things works with the mental side of things, that might also open up for more things. At least that's Martinus says, the real freedom comes when you understand the basic laws of the world, basically. Because then you can start to navigate what the absolute truth is, or what reality is, and not just your perception or assumption about it, which might be wrong. Because when you're wrong, if you have the wrong perceptions or the wrong assumptions, you tend to do things wrong. If you think 2 plus 2 is 5, at some point something will go wrong, right? And then Martinus talks about, this is also why we have the suffering. It's not to really come after us or anything. It's so we can actually get corrected. So we can learn that it's not 5, it's actually 4. Then we might, when 5 doesn't work out, then we might think maybe it's 6, and then we'll go for that, and then we'll learn at some point, okay, that wasn't 6, and then at some point we'll get close to it, right?
So we're in a period of experimentation.
Yeah.
We're trying out various solutions. We'll try maybe with weapons. We'll try with arguments. And we find out, this doesn't work. That doesn't work. Maybe that works, and so on. So, at some point, we'll get to the absolute solution.
At some point, we have learned our lesson.
Some point, we'll have learned our lesson. Yeah.
So that's the idea here.
That's the idea, and then.
And there is a lesson to learn.
Yeah, that's important, isn't it?
And that's the whole point in this. There's actually a lesson. We can actually learn what is going on.
We can learn what's going on, and we can also learn to be loving in all circumstances.
Yeah.
And know what love is in all circumstances.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Lasse Vogelsang, for guesting this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's been very nice to talk to you today.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.